Admission.
Okay, welcome everybody. Bing Sang, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good, thank you. So let's go. I think we've got quite a good audience already, and I will do my intro. Thank you. Welcome to the first collaboration between American College of Clinical Engineering and CEASA on this special day for all clinical engineers. Global Clinical Engineering Day is a worldwide celebration recognizing the important contribution of clinical engineers to healthcare. Happy Clinical Engineering Day to all. I would like to thank all of you for attending, and a special thanks to the CEASA Gold Corporate members, Carl Stoll, Meadold, Fresenius Kabi, Barmaid Healthcare Services, Sakiwo Health Solutions, Minrep Medical, and CEFMED for supporting us. Without you, this type of meeting will not be possible. Thanks to Reef Engineering for setting up the Zoom link. 2020 has been the year of COVID-19, and the role and position of clinical engineers in healthcare has been highlighted and brought to the fore. We, however, felt that with numerous COVID-related webinars in the past few months, we would rather look forward and present something fresh and innovative. We have a very special speaker today. Bing Sang Wang is currently the Vice President, Program Management at Sodexo and the Chair of the American College of Clinical Engineering International Committee, and was instrumental in the collaboration between ACCE and CEASA. Bing Sang is the author of many clinical engineering articles, papers, and books, and his latest book, Fake News Through Facts and Legends in Clinical Engineering, is now available as an ebook. Bing Sang will be presenting on one of his previous titles, Evidence-Based Maintenance of Medical Equipment. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and we'll have an opportunity at the end to get some answered. Over to you, Mr. Wang.
Thank you, Mohammed, for your kind introduction. It is a great honor and privilege to share some experience with my dear South African colleagues. I really think that we need to get started by acknowledging our colleagues around the world for the sacrifice that they have been putting themselves through during this pandemic. Many of you are still facing the risk every day, not just for yourselves, but for your families as well, your loved ones. And so I really want to salute you on this Global CE Day. You are the true heroes of the profession. Okay, Mohammed promised everyone that I will make an outrageous claim during this presentation. So here is my claim. I am claiming that you will be rich and famous after implementing evidence-based maintenance in your hospital, government, or country. If that does not come true, you have to talk to Mohammed because he made me make that promise. Okay? All right. Before we get started, I'm going to make a very brief introduction about the American College of Clinical Engineering. Although you probably know already, it was founded 30 years ago, and with the mission of basically advancing clinical engineering worldwide. And we have currently about 1,500 members in the US and Canada, and about 25,000 collaborating members worldwide. And our current leadership is composed of people from widely different organizations across the US. Some are government hospitals, some are private hospitals, some are independent service organizations, etc. So this shows that we are really a very diverse group here. And as Mohammed mentioned, we have a privilege of establishing early this year an agreement for mutual collaboration and assistance. And this webinar is a clear demonstration of such effort of collaborating with each other. Okay, I'm not going to read my resume here. The presentation has been provided through a PDF to your team there. So just read there as well as the abstract. I don't think there's any need for me to read this here. However, before we move on, I want to caution you that I'm not here really to teach you, because I don't know the South African reality environment that well. I've been there a couple of times before, but that was quite a few years ago. I believe was probably more than 10 years ago. And so I'm definitely out of sync with your reality there. And I don't really want to suggest you that you should follow American methods and ideas. Galileo Galilei said this: you cannot teach a man anything, you can really help him find it within himself. So I think that is very appropriate for this occasion. And also, I want to call your attention to the fact that many of my American colleagues don't even agree with me here. So it's important for you to gain different perspectives. And the most important goal here is, I think you need to understand why we do what we do. As the book that Mohammed mentioned earlier today, there are many legends, many untrue facts that we had in the past. So you really need to understand, and especially the mistakes we have made. Hopefully you don't have to reproduce those mistakes, because imitating what Alexander Pope said, to err is human, to forgive is divine, I would say is, if you can learn from your own mistakes, it's smart, but if you can learn from mistakes made by others, it will be sublime. You will save yourself a lot of trouble. So above all, do not copy the United States. We are not by any means the best nation in terms of healthcare. Okay, so these are the three main sections that we are going to present today, and then I'll go into discussion and conclusions at the end. I am going to try to save about 30 minutes for questions, discussions, or comments, etc. So please don't be shy. So why we need evidence-based maintenance? The classical approach to maintenance of medical equipment, in my mind, is this. Many people have presented this cycle here: plan, acquire equipment, install, accept equipment, utilize equipment, maintenance, management equipment, retirement, replacement of equipment. And most of the time, the equipment is maintained as recommended by the manufacturer, and you want to minimize maintenance costs and also minimize capital investment. That's the classical approach. Unfortunately, if you look more carefully at this whole picture, you realize that the cost of running medical equipment in a hospital is more like an iceberg. The planning acquisition is only 20% of the total cost of ownership. And maintenance and management of equipment is actually a very small fraction, about 1% of the total hospital expense in terms of operating expense. So if we are limiting ourselves to these two blocks here, we are really not doing our best to help our healthcare organizations or government to manage the medical equipment in the best way possible. So what I propose to you is that we need to take a different approach here. We need to use the data that we have collected, not only from your own hospital, but hundreds of other hospitals, to improve the entire process here, capital planning, utilization, maintenance, etc., etc. In other words, what has been missing is this feedback loop that as engineering professionals, we have heard this many, many times, feedback, right, for electronics, etc. But this is actually something that has existed in nature for millions of years. And this is something that we really need to think about. How can we leverage our knowledge experience to improve capital planning, increase utilization, reduce unnecessary maintenance, delay premature replacement of equipment, and enhance safety and protect against cyber attacks? This is the reason I am proposing that we need evidence-based maintenance. And I will explain how to do this soon. But before doing that, I would like to review very briefly the two most predominant strategies for maintenance that have been used in the last 30 years. One is called the risk-based criteria. This is some 30 years old now, and it was first proposed by a former colleague, friend of mine, Dr. Fenico, and it was sanctioned by the Joint Commission, which is a sister organization to the Joint Commission International that you probably have heard. And it's basically a simple equation. The equipment management number is calculated as a combination of function, physical risk, and maintenance requirements. And if this number is above 12, you include the equipment into the inventory and you perform the so-called preventive. I will explain that why I say so-called. It's actually scheduled maintenance, either monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, or annually, according to the number. And if it's below 12, you exclude from the inventory and repair only as needed. And this is the table that was proposed by Dr. Fenico and his assistant. And this has been used for many, many years worldwide. And however, there are some real significant challenges about this method, because both function and physical risk are actually estimates of the so-called risk severity without considering risk probability. What do we mean by that? The international standard 14971 defines risk as the combination of probability and severity of harm. In other words, the fact that something could cause a severe harm, for example, a nuclear reactor exploding will kill immediately millions of people in the vicinity, does not necessarily mean that it has the highest risk or higher risk than, for example, an airplane falling from the sky or even an automobile accident, because the probability is what changes the severity from something that is totally unacceptable, like millions of people dying because of a nuclear reactor accident, versus a car accident, which is actually higher risk for most people because the probability is much higher, even though the severity is maybe involving a handful of people. So we really need to understand that as engineers, clinical engineering professionals, we cannot really change the severity of harm, but our job looks a little strange, but our job is really reduce the probability of anything happening. In addition to this concept, we really also need to understand that we also need to include the scope of harm. How many patients are going to be affected? One single ventilator can kill a patient in a few minutes, but hundreds of infusion pumps in a hospital can harm hundreds of patients in a short period of time as well. So the scope of harm is very important. And the probability is not just something linked to one single person, single device, because there are many, many factors that come together. This is known as the Swiss cheese model of risk that you probably have heard, that it was first proposed by Professor Reason from Scotland. And so this is the reason why I'm saying that the risk-based criteria, unfortunately, does not help us enough to manage medical equipment. The other one that has been propagated for quite some time is called reliability center maintenance. I'm not going to read the definition here, but explain what it means by showing you some graphs here. But the origin of the RCM is from the aviation industry. The United States Air Force, as well as the commercial airlines, starting to study the reliability safety of aircraft for quite some time, and concluded that one way to address this is to really understand how things come into a situation that can inflict harm to passengers, and therefore we need to control that. Back in 2011, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid issued a initial note, and then 2013 they updated that note saying that, oh, RCM would be a good methodology. So, but the people who quoted RCM did not quite fully understand how RCM works. Here is a diagram that shows how RCM really works. So you have to go through step by step of this flow chart here in order to understand what you need to do. Unfortunately, there are significant limitations in the area of medical equipment versus commercial airlines, for example. Okay, because we work in an environment that a failure can easily harm a patient, not just the environment. Okay, and so we really need to understand what we need to do. If that is the case, RCM says you need to reduce the probability, as I mentioned before. And if the probability can be reduced by so-called preventive maintenance, you should do that. But if it is not acceptable, the level of probability of failure, then you need to redesign the equipment. This is unfortunately something that as clinical engineering professionals, we are not allowed here in the United States by federal regulation called the Food and Drug Administration regulations. I believe you folks in South Africa and other countries very likely will have also similar type of regulations that you cannot just go into a piece of medical equipment and modifying it. Okay, so the challenges here is basically that we don't fully understand how the equipment works. So the so-called failure mode and effect analysis is very hard to figure out and try to analyze the effects, the consequences. Especially nowadays, most of the equipment is based on software. The software are obviously closed. And also very often manufacturers do not provide detailed maintenance schedules instructions with justification why those things are necessary. They just say, do this. Well, do this does not really give you the answer to the question why. And here in the United States, I don't know how about in South Africa. We here in the United States have significant challenge in getting those work instructions. So that makes this RCM very, very difficult to be applied. Okay, so let's talk about evidence-based maintenance, what it means, etc. As Mohammed mentioned, I published a book last year about this. You can acquire it in both paperback and printed, electronic versions. I'm not trying to sell book here, but I'm just trying to say that there are references available. Besides my book, a whole number of papers have been published, not just by myself, also by people in Italy. They have reproduced this methodology there and found it very useful. And also in Brazil, people are starting to use this methodology, but they have not yet published anything that I can share with you. Okay, so you asked me, what is evidence-based maintenance? I can give you a whole bunch of words here, okay? And it's probably going to go in from one year and get out from another year, and you will promptly forget about it. So being a simple-minded person, I think it's easier for me to show you a few pictures, and I think you can understand the concept very quickly. Okay, so the first picture is that I like fishing. Fishing for me, I need tackle, I need a boat, I need fishing rods, lures, etc. to catch fish. This is my structure. It's like your hospital, your medical equipment. Fishing is a process. It's like your doctor using a medical equipment to diagnose or perform surgery on a patient. So fishing for me is a process of putting out the lure and attract the fish, and then finally catching the fish. If I catch the fish, that's the outcome that is needed to prove that I have done the right thing. Of course, you could say, well, it's luck. Yeah, it's luck if it's only occasionally I catch fish. But if I consistently catch fish, then I can claim that this is not just luck, this is a real process that can be reproduced. And that's why you need data to prove this, okay? So it's not just a claim now, much less an outrageous claim, Mohammed, okay? All right. Now, why did I choose the term evidence-based maintenance? I did it on purpose because there is a concept called evidence-based medicine that most of you probably know well. And it is basically the same concept here. The only real difference is that we are treating a patient called medical equipment. Okay, we are not medical doctors. We are clinical engineering professionals, and our patient is not a human being, but it's a piece of medical equipment. Okay, so by using this analogy, it's very easy to remember, and more importantly, very easy to convey this concept to our clinical colleagues and your executives in the healthcare system, hospital, et cetera, because you say, hey, I'm doing the same thing that you folks are doing in evidence-based medicine. They say, oh, okay, I know what you're talking about. So bottom line here is that we are both doing the same thing, but actually, in reality, both evidence-based maintenance, evidence-based medicine is nothing but the so-called scientific method. Okay. In this handout I sent to you guys, I have a little more explanation there, but I'm not going to spend time and try to move this ahead. Please read the slides later if you want to understand better. Okay, so what we do in terms of evidence-based maintenance, we have to plan the maintenance strategy. We have to select a maintenance strategy. Typically, we use something called scheduled maintenance. Scheduled maintenance is actually composed of two parts: preventive maintenance, because there are things that are going to deteriorate in a predictable manner with time. For example, in the ventilator, you have an oxygen cell that, because of using chemical components, is going to deteriorate time and it's going to wear out. Rubber gaskets is another example. Okay, so you need to perform preventive maintenance, but very often they are nothing to be replaced, but you still need to check, and we'll see in a couple of minutes why you need to check certain things, okay, that we call safety and performance inspection, because there are hidden and potential failures that needs to be detected that is not self-evident. Okay, so this combination is what I call scheduled maintenance, or some people may call planned maintenance, but it's, I think, easier to avoid confusion by separating these two. And by explaining how these two concepts are separate, I think it's easier to understand that scheduled maintenance is a function of technology. It's not a function of risk or criticality. In other words, we talked before about the risk-based criteria, and the concept there was that the higher risk we need to do maintenance there because it's high risk, because it's going to kill a patient if the ventilator fails to work. However, they forgot about the probability part that we actually manipulate through maintenance, through manufacturers, also through the design of the equipment. Okay, so at the end of the day, it's because of the technology used for the construction of the equipment that we need to do certain things for the equipment to remain safe and reliable. For example, CRT tubes in TVs and patient monitors, in the old days, you had that big vacuum tube, and those things did not last very long. Nowadays, we use LED panels, and LED panels do not require any preventive maintenance. There's nothing you can do to prevent, to replace there. You have to replace basically the whole panel if some of the pixels there goes bad. In the old days, we had X-ray film processors that was very messy because of the chemicals involved. Nowadays, it's digital X-ray. There's nothing to be cleaned, nothing to be replaced in terms of chemicals anymore. Internal combustion engine requires oil change, but the new electric vehicles, the purely electrical vehicles, do not require oil change because there's no oil there. Okay, so technology dictates the maintenance requirement. And so please, severity, higher severity does not mean higher maintenance. Higher maintenance is dictated by the technology used. Okay. Corrective maintenance. We should repair equipment only as needed, okay, and especially if it's not too costly, because if it's, let's say, over 25% of the replacement costs, go ahead and replace it. Of course, I'm assuming that you have money in your capital investment budget for that purpose. Patient monitors based on solid state electronics. Nowadays, you have to replace infusion pumps. There's very little you can repair except a few simple things like replace the door that has cracked or dropping because it was dropping on the floor or something like that. So there are many reference documentation that you can use. And also, I would suggest that you folks discuss among yourselves. CEASA may be able to help different hospitals share data about what is the proper scheduled and corrective maintenance that is really needed for each type of equipment. Okay. So what I want to advance is that those things that I spoke before, scheduled maintenance and corrective maintenance, is nothing new. You probably know that I have done that. What I want to talk about is evaluation, is to analyze the data you have accumulated. Here in the United States, unfortunately, we have been collecting data for over 30 years, and very, very seldom we have looked at the data. And that's the problem that we need to address, because our goal is to ensure safety and reliability of equipment. Okay, doesn't matter whether we are performing scheduled maintenance or unscheduled maintenance. So we have to perform two types of evaluation. Safety evaluation, to see whether our maintenance strategy is enhancing the safety of the patient and users, as well as the reliability. These are the two things that really define our role in the healthcare environment. And these two are interrelated. They are basically two sides of the same coin. Okay, you do maintenance not just to improve safety or improve reliability. Both goes hand in hand at the same time. Okay, so for this to happen, we need to understand the cause of the failures, the root cause of failure. If we don't understand why something fell, we just, oh, broke. Yeah, broke does not mean anything. Okay, I can fix it, but why did it break? Because someone dropped it on the floor accidentally, or something inside the machine happened, and was that because a part needed to be replaced was not replaced on time, or it was a random electronic failure that no one could have predicted, prevented, and so that is a different set of whys, causes that we need to understand. Okay, so if we understand why failed, we can decide what to do about it. Of course, to do a full RCA, root cause analysis, is very time consuming, and we don't have time typically to do that. But thankfully, a simplified RCA is possible and is uh, useful for us to analyze and then decide what to do. So we are not asking you to do anything extraordinary here. Your technicians, your hands-on engineers just need to understand what's the cause of the problem for later on investigate may be better. So again, like evidence-based medicine, evidence-based maintenance is to find ways to address the failure root causes and use outcomes to determine which one works best. Okay. All right. So here are the failure cause codes that we have used in the past. Some people say that they would like to have few more. Some would say too much. Fine. This is just a suggestion for you to consider. The idea of use as few as possible is important because you don't want to give out dozens or hundreds of possible codes and your people get crazy selecting them. And more importantly, you don't get enough data to make a statistically meaningful analysis. Okay, so for example, no problem found. This is very common when you perform a scheduled maintenance inspection and do not find any problem with it. Or somebody said, oh, the equipment is broken. You go there and could not duplicate the problem. So it may be it's a misunderstanding, or maybe there is an intermittent problem there that you don't know about, that you will only find out the next time it happens again. Okay, unpreventable failure is typically normal wear and tear, and it's unpredictable. And this is the most common electronic failure for solid state electronics. Accessories, of course, batteries, okay, and network. Nowadays, a lot of equipment is network, and very often a piece of equipment appears to be not functioning well, but actually the problem is the connection with the network and the server, etc. Use. This is a very broad term. It could be abuse, could be abnormal wear and tear, accident, somebody dropped infusion pump, as I mentioned before, or a lightning hit a building and burn out a whole bunch of equipment. That is not equipment's fault. It's an external factor here. Evident failure, a failure that can be detected and was known to the user, but the user choose not to report it and saying, oh, I don't use that particular feature of this device, so I'm not ignoring it. And when you go to check it, say, oh, but there is a problem with this device. The user says, I don't care, I don't use it. Okay. Now here are 4 very important ones that are within our direct control. Service-induced failure. Just like any other human being, we make mistakes, as well as parts that are introduced into the equipment, even brand new. Sometimes they have an early failure that is known similar to the infant mortality in healthcare. So we need to talk to the supplier, often the manufacturer of that part of the equipment, say, hey, there's a problem here. We are seeing too many service-induced failures here. Hidden failure is something that is even more problematic because this is something that the user does not know about it. In the past, this was very common. Nowadays, it's becoming less and less common because most manufacturers have built in error detection software in the devices that alert the user that, hey, there's something wrong here, do not use me. Okay. And this is not just for the protection of the patient or even the user, but in the United States, this is used primarily by the manufacturer to protect themselves against lawsuits. Here we have a tendency of having too many lawyers, and they just go and sue everybody whenever somebody gets harmed. And the manufacturer will use this to protect themselves, saying, hey, my machine told you that it has a problem and you still decided to use it. And therefore, it's not our fault that the patient get harmed. Okay. Potential failure is something that is in the process happening, like a power cord that is fraying but has not completely shorted out. And if you detect that, you need to correct that. And this is by far the most important one that we want to avoid. We want to reduce the probability of happening is preventable and predictable failure. Sometimes wear and tear that was not predicted or suggested by the manufacturer that we found out later that using a device in a, for example, environment that is very dusty or the power line fluctuates a lot, then you have a lot of problems. So we really need to do something about this as soon as we detect that. Okay, so how do we use this information? Okay, here is infusion pump, single channel infusion pump, scheduled maintenance only, 24 months. We perform that to see what happens. Okay, as you can see, the majority of times we perform scheduled maintenance, we didn't find anything, nothing surprising. Once in a while, we find battery problems, evident failure problems that was not reported by the user, a crack in the door, okay, potential failure, power cord that's becoming frayed, okay. Single hospital again, corrective maintenance. Corrective maintenance, very often, infusion pump problem is due to battery that has not been charged properly. And so this is something that we are missing and have to go back to retrain the users to plug in the infusion pump whenever possible. And sometimes there are use problems that we have, as well as cannot duplicate. They complain there's a problem, we didn't find. The reason I'm showing 24 months is to show that this is unfortunately something that is difficult to prevent, and this happens quite often and fluctuates from month to month. But at the end of the year, or in this case 2 years, you can take a statistical average here and standard deviation to show that you have a meaningful statistics to analyze. So from there, we calculate the annual failure probability of finding a particular problem, a type of problem. I'm not going to go through this in detail. You can read this later for yourselves. But this is what we calculate after this data. For one single hospital, over a period of 12 consecutive months, we can find this kind of statistics here. So this is the failure probability. If I work on a piece of equipment, doesn't matter whether it's scheduled maintenance or corrective maintenance, I can expect battery problem to be the most common, no problem found is second, and then use problems, etc., etc. And these last four are the four that I single out before, and I had to expand the scale because they're so small that it becomes very difficult to see. Okay. All right. A different type of equipment. And now I'm showing not just one hospital, I'm showing several hospitals to show that the same type of challenges exist across hospitals. This is not unique to one hospital because we are talking about the same type of equipment, electrosurgical units. Okay. And so now with this kind of data at hand, we can compare, for example, the effectiveness of your maintenance strategy comparing manufacturer recommendation, I call OEM, versus hospital strategy, we call alternative equipment maintenance strategy for multi-parameter patient monitors. Now we have two groups, okay? Each group has a different number of units, but they are somewhat comparable. And as you can see, yes, they have differences, but if you consider not just the mean, the bar, the height of the bar, but the standard deviation on top of them, they are actually not that different. Okay, so why are you spending time doing things exactly as recommended by the manufacturer if you can find a more efficient way to do it? And this same analogy happened, kind of study happened with many other different devices, telemetry transmitter, aspirator, examination lights, Doppler flow detector, etc. We did not have time to analyze big imaging machines because the number of units is very small. Therefore, you needed several years, 3 years at least, to accumulate enough data to compute the statistics here. Okay, so let me move ahead and talk a little bit about safety evaluation. So we can show the outcomes are the same, but how about safety? You're going to ask me, but did anyone get hurt? So patient incidents, including close calls, the patient did not get hurt, sometimes also known as near misses, but we wanted to know that if was not caught on time, it was not intervened by the clinician, somebody could have been hurt. So we are going to analyze every single incident using the same method and assign a failure cost code to it so we can understand what could be done about it, okay? And the ones that are the service-induced failure, hidden failure, potential failure, and predictable, preventable failures are the ones that we really need to look into more detail to see whether it is something due to a particular individual or it is because our maintenance strategy is the one causing the problem. That is known in the literature as latent condition. Our strategy was the one that failed. It's not one person doing the wrong thing, forgot to perform a certain task, etc. So here I'm going to show you statistics obtained in a decade, 2004 to 2013, when I was working for another company, and during which I analyzed every single patient incident that totaled 518 in that decade. And of those, we investigate the majority of them, not every single one, because hospitals sometimes did not allow us meaning the independent service organization, to investigate. They were concerned about possible conflict of interest. And so they investigate themselves. Okay, and then we analyze the ones that had harm to almost 200, including deaths. Okay, incident with death 70 some, incident with that, but was not related to equipment or accessories. And finally, that did include equipment or accessory 200, and the number that actually related to maintenance problems, 6, which is less than basically 1% of what happened during the whole decade. Now, I need to give you a perspective about this. During this whole 10-year decade, we were managing 9.7 almost million pieces of equipment. This is from well over 500 hospitals, okay? We performed 7.7 million scheduled maintenance and almost 4 million corrective maintenance. So this is from a very, very large database. So 6 in such a large amount is a very, very small percentage, but we nonetheless investigated them and found out that why this 6 happened, okay? Just as something for you to understand, this safety evaluation showed that we are comparable to the commercial aviation in the industrialized nations in terms of safety record, and we are not really putting any patient at jeopardy by using methods that are different from those recommended by the manufacturer. Okay, so this data has been published. You can read that at your leisure. But the bottom line here is that this is indeed something that we can use to show, to prove that we are not putting patients at jeopardy. Okay, let's move on to reliability evaluation. As I said, this is the counterpart of safety evaluation. Here, I'm going to use a simple example of a smaller group to make things a little bit easier to understand. Again, I'm not going to read all this, but the important thing is some people have a tendency of using the so-called mean time between failure. The problem is that mean time between failure includes failures that are not predictable or preventable. For example, someone dropped accidentally a infusion pump on the floor. That is okay. You could say, oh, I could use training, education to prevent that, but that is not possible to reduce that risk to zero. And it's really not clinical engineering function in terms of maintenance strategy here. Okay, we are going to talk about other uh, uh, responsibilities that we have to address that. Okay, so let me show you an example. We use a small hospital group, 3 sites, 8,000 pieces of equipment, and we were analyzing corrective maintenance, scheduled maintenance there, and we found out there was a high number of hidden failures there. And we said, well, that's very strange. What's wrong with this piece of equipment? And then we found out that this was something called oxygen concentrator that was used for elderly patients in this long-term care facility. And we were performing maintenance exactly as recommended by the manufacturer. But the failure rate was higher because we found out that in this particular place, the environment was very dusty, and the molecular sieve bed that is used to sequester nitrogen and therefore concentrate oxygen was getting dirty quicker than expected. Manufacturer recommended replacement every 10 years, but every 5 years we were starting to see deterioration of the oxygen concentration. So actually, when you perform evidence-based maintenance, you may end up concluding that you have to perform maintenance at higher frequency than those recommended by manufacturer. You're not always saving money, saving time. Okay, so once you find out this kind of evaluations, you can perform the so-called corrective and preventive actions to correct things, training, revisions of instructions, discipline actions, people doing the wrong things, and even revision of your maintenance strategy if necessary. Okay, so this is the feedback loop that I talked about, the scientific method. Okay, okay, so let me go quickly through the discussions and conclusions so we can have time for questions and comments. There are limitations. Evidence-based maintenance, we try to imitate evidence-based medicine, but there are limitations. First, you know that equipment is designed by people, so it's less complex, and equipment does not suffer from psychosomatic effects. So we don't need to blind the equipment, but we cannot blind the clinical engineering professionals either. When you do double blind randomized clinical trials with drugs, you blind the patient and you blind the nurse. They don't know whether they are taking placebo or real drug. Okay, we cannot do that here. So we are really applying a method called cohort study, in which the outcome of 2 groups of patients are compared, one having received a certain therapy while the other did not. So this is still a valid evidence-based medicine method, but it's not the so-called double-blind randomized clinical trial. Our data show that service-induced failure is very rare, but we still need to be aware of that. Okay, and most of the problems are caused by active failures. That is really understandable. Humans make mistakes, and we need to focus on that. And true PMs, preventive maintenance, is becoming obsolete and really does not provide job security to anyone who thinks that, oh, I have to do this because you will guarantee my job. And worse yet, artificial intelligence and machine learning will allow predictive maintenance is starting already to surface here in the United States, that will eliminate the need for scheduled maintenance because they can tell you ahead of time when certain replacements are needed. And as I said before, don't rely on mean time between failure because some failures are not predictable, preventable. But we did show that evidence-based maintenance can be applied to all modalities, biomed, imaging lab, anything. There is no reason to follow manufacturer recommendation for one particular modality group of equipment. This was, again, as I said, reproduced in Italy, and also a few other countries are starting to do that. In Brazil, some colleagues are applying this to the university hospitals in Brazil, and hopefully they are going to share some results pretty soon. Now, I don't want to mislead you. It's not easy to implement evidence-based maintenance because you have to collect data, you have to train people to collect the data correctly. But just because it's difficult, we should shy away from it? I don't think so. Okay, I think we should learn from President Kennedy when many decades ago he said that we choose to go to the moon because, not because it was easy, because it's hard, but because to reach that goal, we are going to learn a lot of things. Actually, most of the modern medical equipment, electronics, etc., came from that exercise. So the data that we get and analyze can show us what is the right thing to do, and we can do it right and at the lowest possible cost. So at the end, how do we really improve equipment management maintenance by performing evidence-based maintenance? As I said before, why perform maintenance if it does not really reduce failure or increase safety? There are a whole lot of other things that we need to do. We need to help plan and select better equipment before purchase. We need to help the user to understand and use better equipment. Equipment are becoming more and more sophisticated, complicated. Help users to understand, take better care of the equipment. Help to determine when equipment really needs to be replaced, not just because a new piece of equipment with bells and whistles came out that needs replacement. No, we really need to help them understand how to conserve the capital and investigate patient incidents, because then we can prevent those incidents from happening in the future. We need to address recalls promptly to reduce risk. I don't need to remind you, but infusion pump, the so-called smart pumps, are the ones that have the most recalls for compared to any other medical device in the last decade. So this is becoming a significant burden to everyone. And finally, cybersecurity is becoming a significant issue everywhere, especially here in the United States. So all this basically come back to what I said before. This feedback cycle is what we need to do using the data that we have collected. Let's not just do the work, but also use our brains to help manage. Clinical engineering is maintenance plus management. It's not just maintenance, okay? We need to have both components here. Okay, thank you for your attention. Lots of people contributed. I am only responsible for the mistakes and confusion that I may have caused in this presentation. So I am available for questions, comments that you have. And if you don't get a chance to answer all your questions, please contact me directly as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bing Sang. A very enlightening presentation. Just a few questions in the chat box. I just need to scroll back up. So from I think it's Angus. What is the legal situation when maintenance is not carried out in accordance with manufacturer's recommendations?
Okay, I cannot
One of your
answer.
favorite topics.
Yeah, I cannot answer that for South Africa because I certainly don't know your reality there. In the United States, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is the federal agency that controls the money, they don't directly regulate hospitals, but they control the money that goes to hospitals and accounts for more than 40% of the hospital income. So they control the hospitals via the money, via the purse string, as we say. They have dictated that maintenance of imaging equipment, radiological imaging equipment, and medical lasers need to be performed exactly as recommended by the manufacturers. Whereas the rest, we can use alternative equipment maintenance methods as long as we evaluate the safety and effectiveness of our method and prove that we are not putting patient at jeopardy. Now, I also know that in many countries, some hospitals voluntarily comply with the Joint Commission International Standards, which is different from the Joint Commission standards in the United States. There, to the best of my understanding, Joint Commission International still requires hospitals to perform maintenance per manufacturer recommendation. I don't understand why that is the case, doesn't make any sense. And by the way, if you ask the manufacturer's service representatives, they will tell you honestly that they don't perform exactly as recommended by their own companies, because the recommendations are typically written by the design engineers at the beginning of the production, and they don't rarely come back and revise those things. And so many of those recommendations are not valid, and sometimes the sequence is not logical. So the service engineers themselves develop their own methods based on their own experience. Of course, they are not going to put this on a piece of paper and sign it, because they are going to be sued and they'll lose their jobs. Okay. Next question.
So just on that point, from my limited understanding, maintenance of equipment in South Africa is governed by the OSH Act, General Machine Regulation, and there's no prescription on how you do maintenance, as long as you're doing it, and you can prove it in a court of law that you are doing it according to a scientific method. So, in my opinion, this kind of maintenance solution should stand up if you've done your work correctly. Okay. If I can just move on. Doe asked, does the equipment designer and manufacturing not take the probability of failure as the main criteria to work out service schedule intervals?
Well, in theory, yes, because they are required by either the FDA rules here in the United States or international standard like 13485 in Europe. Again, I don't know about South Africa, so my apologies there. They are required to follow the standard called 14971, risk management. As I mentioned before, unfortunately, their scope of view is very limited. They focus on individual patients. So if I make a ventilator, I will see what's the probability of failure versus severity of failure for that piece of equipment. Just like I do that for an infusion pump. However, they ignore the fact that certain piece of equipment has impact over a much broader range of people. For example, I did not mention here, but you probably have in your hospital something called clinical laboratory that have those huge analyzers that churn out dozens, hundreds, even thousands of diagnostics per hour. I have never seen any doctor, surgeon who would open up a patient or prescribe a medication without looking at the results of those clinical laboratory analysis, right? Now, if that piece of equipment fails, it's not just one patient that is going to be affected. We're talking now about literally hundreds of patients, okay? And that is not required for the manufacturer to consider. Manufacturer look at one patient at a time, okay? So even though they do that, they don't do that, in my mind, comprehensively with the wide scope. Second, as I mentioned before, they do that initially during the design phase and maybe in the service recommendations side. And to protect themselves, as I mentioned here, our litigious society, they over-prescribe maintenance. Why? Because it's your time, your money, and by the way, I can sell more service, I can sell more parts, of course, I'm going to double, triple the recommendation because I don't have to justify it. I just have to say, in my wisdom, I recommend that. So they very, very seldom go back and revise and change. Okay, so in theory, they do, but in practice, we have not seen them doing a good job.
Thank you, Vincent. I think there's one more question from Shija. Interested to know the typical roadmap Bing Sang would recommend to implement evidence-based maintenance from scratch.
Well, unfortunately, it's going to take a little bit of time to do that. Again, I'm not here to sell my book, but you can find a roadmap there to some extent. But I want to caution you that you need to be very careful in adopting any roadmap, it's like driving directions. You go into a car, you turn on your Google map and get driving directions, right? That direction is generally good and ultimately will take you there, but it is very possible that you know of a shortcut or a better route than that one, okay? So what I'm trying to say is that I can give you a roadmap, but it's a general guidance. It will take you there, but it may not be the best one according to your particular environment. You need to use the principles and then adapt it to your local reality. Because as I said before, here in the United States, we have the privilege of having air conditioning, filtered air, stabilized electricity sources, et cetera, in our hospitals. In many other countries, and I'm not trying to badmouth South Africa and any other less industrialized country, no. But we know that it is a challenge. Even here in the United States, in the more remote areas, we have such challenges. So certain things that you can do in the metropolitan areas, you cannot do in remote areas. As I mentioned before, Mohammed, before we started, in the northern part of the United States, it's already snowing. We have hospitals in North Dakota, for example, where in the winter it's almost impossible to get there sometimes for a week. So you need to store more parts, train better your people, be prepared for those contingencies. Okay, so I can give you some gross ideas that, okay, take your inventory, analyze your inventory, and start addressing the most common equipment. Don't start with CTs, MRIs, because there are too few for you to really do something about it in order to get enough data. Get the common equipment, the infusion pumps, the patient monitors, vital signs monitors, et cetera, and start looking at them. And by the way, I'm trying to be honest here. I'm not trying to criticize anyone. The people that you need to ask these questions are your own frontline service people. They know by experience to tell you, hey, I told you so that we don't need to do this, and you never listen to me. Okay. Another example that I call fake news, electrical safety test. For over 50 years, we have been doing electrical safety tests every single time we open a piece of equipment, either for scheduled maintenance or for corrective maintenance. Turn out that it is totally unnecessary. Okay, unless you go and try to do something in the electrical portion of the equipment that has alternating current, 110 volts, et cetera. Basically the power source. If you don't touch the power source, you just replace an oxygen sensor. Why do you have to perform electrical safety tests? Okay, the technologies evolved so fast in the last 50 years. Most of the manufacturers have basically taken out all the electrical safety risk from their equipment using solid-state electronics, optical couplers, et cetera. So now, after many years of fighting with our own government and standards organization, we finally convinced the National Fire Protection Agency to change our electrical safety standard to perform electrical safety tests only when we first receive that piece of equipment in the hospital, or when we make a repair or maintenance that affects the electrical safety part of that piece of equipment. Otherwise, we don't have to perform routine electrical safety tests. That by itself can save you probably at least 10, 15 minutes per device every year or even twice a year. So you can easily determine how much savings in time you can get from there.
I see the questions continue coming in. I think we've exceeded our proposed time, but Ping Seng, if you allow us to ask one more, and I'm going to combine two questions, if you don't mind.
Oh, I certainly be happy to stay here for another 10 minutes or even.
Okay, that's good. So in terms of defibrillator maintenance, is the manufacturer recommendation just strictly followed? I think you've answered this previously. So I'm going to just jump to the next question, and you can comment on that one if you'd like.
Okay.
And what is the criteria of performing maintenance on low maintenance equipment, or I guess low risk maintenance equipment? Example, oxygen flow meters and vacuum regulators.
Okay, let me try to answer both. First, let me answer the easy one first, the low maintenance equipment. Flow meters, don't bother to do that. I had some trouble here in the United States with some surveyors acting on behalf of the government inspecting our hospital saying, you guys are not calibrating flow meters. I told them, look, the doctors do not rely on those markings of the flow meters. He said, really? I don't trust you. So this surveyor organization went to one of the best known hospitals in the United States called Mayo Clinic and went to talk to the emergency department director there. Do you guys want the clinical engineering professionals to check flow meter? Don't you want to do that? Isn't that important? This has a marking on the flow rate. The doctor looked at him and said, no, we don't do that. We don't care. What we do is we put a pulse oximeter on the finger or on the foot of the baby and measure the oxygen saturation. If the oxygen saturation is not high enough, I turn that higher. Otherwise, I can reduce that. So I adjust the flow not according to the number that is marked there, but according to the outcome of the patient. This is evidence-based medicine, remember? Okay, so the lesson here is that first, there's nothing you can do to calibrate or recalibrate that flow meter or vacuum regulator, etc. If it breaks, you replace it most of the time. Maybe sometimes you can do a little bit of cleaning and because there are some dirt in there. But otherwise, don't bother to schedule maintenance there. Okay. Repair if possible, otherwise replace. Okay. Now, coming back to defib. First, let's clarify there are two different things here. One is calibration, the testing of defibrillator by the users, by clinicians, and the other one is by the clinical engineering professionals. We often have the confusion that, the nurses are checking the defibrillators and they should unplug the defibrillator and test the defibrillator to see whether it's working. And this will test not just the function of the defibrillator, but the battery inside the defibrillator. This is a totally erroneous concept. The clinicians themselves, Association of Clinicians, published a paper many, many years ago saying that the reason for forcing the nurses to test defibrillators either at the beginning of the shift or after in a week or whatever the frequency is only to get them used to use defibrillators, because defibrillators are used so infrequently in the normal patient wards. This is not ambulances or emergency departments. the nurses forget how to use them, especially in the old days when you had to turn a switch between monitoring and defibrillation mode. And so sometimes they lose a patient because they forgot to turn from the monitoring mode to defibrillation mode. Okay, and also to make sure that the accessories are there, the electrodes, the pads, etc., etc. Now, the maintenance portion of the defibrillator, there is one thing that I highly recommend to follow manufacturer recommendation until you have enough data to decide to make any changes, is checking the battery. The battery is a rechargeable battery. If it's not lasting long enough, it's not going to hold charge, then you need to replace that. It is a wearable part that needs to be replaced, so you need to schedule that. Also, it does not hurt to check the output of the defibrillator periodically, and that can be done annually or every 18 months, even if you want to stretch that. And I don't think there is a significant savings in time in doing that, so I would rather do that out of abundance of precaution. But the important thing here is really remind the users to not unplug the defibrillator when they go to test it, because that has caused a number of accidents that we have seen here in the United States, including death of patients.
Thank you, Vincent. The next question, let me see. Calibration and electrical safety tests could be considered tasks performed during SPI, safety and performance tests. Is that right?
Depends what you call calibration. Let me answer first about calibration. Calibration verification is indeed part of the safety and performance inspection. However, recalibration, if the device is found to be out of calibration, that should be considered a corrective maintenance. So you should close this work order for safety and performance inspection and say that device did not pass the inspection, and I need to recalibrate the equipment, and I need to open a work order to recalibrate the equipment. Okay, so calibration is actually composed of two parts: calibration verification and calibration adjustment, so-called recalibration. Now, electrical safety test is not part mandatory for safety and performance inspection anymore, unless it is a new incoming piece of equipment. Otherwise, routine safety performance inspection in a hospital does not require electrical safety test, at least here in the United States. I cannot say about South Africa, or in this case, Gustavo is from Brazil. No, I cannot say about Brazil. Each country sometimes have its own set of laws, regulations.
Okay, I think it's the last question. At what age must the equipment be to apply or calculate accurately EBM? Will this not be difficult for new equipment? And if I can add a little bit there, how much data would you need to make it significant to make a decision on EBM? I see you use 24 months, but
good question. Yes, as most lawyers will answer, it depends. No, I'm just joking. No, the age is not the matter here. Okay, I'm not trying to defend myself because I'm old. Okay, but let me explain. What you really need is amount of data. Okay, the reason we did 12 months, 24 months before is because we needed to convince ourselves first that we are getting stable data. In other words, we saw variations month to month, okay? And we needed to see that that would stabilize for a single hospital, and then for multiple hospitals, the same phenomenon will reproduce. Because otherwise, we are dealing with something that we cannot control because the statistics is not stable. Now, for those who had a little bit of statistics in high school, you probably remember it is meaningless to calculate average standard deviation when you have only 5 points or even 10 points. You need to have something like at least 15 points of data to make some calculations that is meaningful. So what I recommend is that look at equipment that you have many units of similar brands and models, preferably identical brands and models that are used in the same way. For example, do not mix defibrillators using ambulances versus those used in hospital because they are used in a very different environment. The ones using ambulances are likely to be used very intensively and therefore break more often, even by accident, okay? Now, if you can isolate enough defibrillators in the hospital, enough infusion pumps, enough patient monitors, I'll go for those first because you can get enough data in a year even to perform a very solid analysis. Now, if you have a brand new piece of equipment that just came into the hospital, even if you had 10 pieces of that equipment, it will probably still take a year or two to get data. So I would not recommend, it's not the age, it's how much time you had to accumulate data here that is important. That piece of equipment may be old. You got a donation from another hospital or another country, the equipment is already 5 years old, has nothing to do with age, has to do with how much data you can accumulate. And that's why I recommended CEASA to consider about sharing data among different hospitals without necessarily showing the names, without sharing financial expenditures, etc., that make people uncomfortable, okay? Just sharing the actual number of failures, problems you found. So by that way, you can easily determine when you have few pieces. For example, as I mentioned, CTs, MRs, you are likely to have a few only in each hospital. But if you can group enough hospitals, you can probably start to get meaningful data for statistical analysis. The same thing goes for ultrasound units. They're expensive. They're not likely to have many in one single hospital. But if you group many hospitals together, then you can get meaningful data. And by the way, besides the lasers and radiological imaging equipment that our government does not allow us to use alternative maintenance strategies. It says also that we cannot do this for brand new pieces of equipment for which we did not have accumulated enough data. So it's the same concept here.
Thank you, Benson.
Questions?
I think there's a lot of appreciation and thanks. And on behalf of CEASA, we'd like to thank you for attending. I wish I could give you a little gift. I'll get away with it this time.
We have a virtual.
And yeah, in the words of Mladen, it's a privilege to listen to the best. Thank you. And we're looking forward to inviting you back for another session.
It's my great pleasure and honor again with so many great friends, many for many years, like Mladen, etc. And again, please use this carefully to adapt to your own conditions and realities. And if there's anything I can do to help you, by all means, please reach out to me. And Mohammed, thank you so much for this invitation. I really appreciate the friendship and cooperation here. Thank you very much and have a nice rest of the day for all the people participating. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Global CE Day, everybody. Bye.
Happy Global CE Day.